not Trumpist Republicans. You can debate everyone else in the GOP, and probably some borderline cases, right? But like, what happens to them, right? Do you have never Trump Republicans, or at least Trump agnostic Republicans, who can get elected, right? If they can, that creates more checks and balances, not against like the ACA being dismantled, right? But against things that would undermine our democracy. So it's almost like you have to treat this as like a three-party situation almost.
Do Americans care in the sense that obviously, anybody who will, read reports or listen to this podcast or interact with, academics who observe politics and things like that, everyone's, very concerned, distressed about all of this. But is worrying about American democracy as an institution surviving, et cetera, is that going to motivate voters? Is that something that like turns people out in a midterm? Or
no. I mean, people care about bread and butter issues. I think America, which is all of which is to say, people care about the things ultimately in the long term and when they go to the voting booth about what most affects them day to day. And I think that's right. That makes sense. Broadly, the question you're asking is a question that I think is kind of like faced America from the very beginning in probably every democracy or republic or whatever you want to call this form of government, which is there is always a certain segment of the population, the elites, or however you want to put it, that pays attention to this kind of stuff. And I think, has often been condescending about it. Like if you look at the direct election of United States senators and that whole debate, we spent a lot of the years of our history trying to protect the government from the people, right? We didn't trust the people. Why didn't we trust the people? Well, because we felt like they were not informed enough about the process. And I think we've spent a lot of the past, let's say 100 years since the progressive movement trying to do a lot more to educate more people, to make, civics and reading and all of the things that make a good informed citizenry a bigger part of our country. And I think that's a good thing. But it does mean that a lot of people, I think, logically, will not be motivated by going to the ballot box to save democracy. And I think politicians should continue to speak to the literal survival needs of people, right? Like, it's a pretty hard question. You're not going to ever motivate people, I think, in a broad swath to say, this vague idea that we're going to tell you about in a book and that we want to make you feel and see broadly in your daily life, because I do think it manifests itself in your daily life. We want you to go to the ballot box and vote for that abstract idea. That's just not going to happen. I think democracy exists for people. You just make it exist for people in much more concrete ways, and often that comes to specific policy goals that might be imbued with certain values. But it's not like you can't run on that necessarily. Voting access is probably a separate thing, but even that is like a much more concrete, tangible aspect of democracy.
I don't know how we're defining democracy, but to me, we had the largest turnout in a long time. We had a huge turnout, and I think a lot of people who say they voted against Trump would say they were voting to save democracy by voting against Trump. In 2018, we had very large turnout. I think a lot of people who voted against Trump would say, I voted against Trump to save democracy. So I think if Wisconsin and Georgia try to send Republican electors forward, I think you'd see big protests. So I think there is do people care if Barr fires a U.S. attorney? No. Do people care about, the sort of minor things, a lot of the stories I've written about democratic norms, about, the White House press conferences or things like that? No, I don't think people care about that. I do think this sort of, if this election if there was a serious threat of this election being overturned, I think you would have seen people care about that. And I think I'll be curious what happens in this Georgia election. If there are shenanigans there, I think people will get very engaged by if there's a perception that black people are not allowed to vote, I think you'll see very strong protest against that. So I think democracy as a whole maybe is sort of complicated, but I think if there are attempts to subvert people's right to vote, I think you will see the right to their vote counting. I think you will see some real action there. I think that's sort of worth watching going forward.
Yeah, if you look at a Fox News poll by a 56 to 36 margin, people thought Trump disputing the results is weakening American democracy, so 20-point margin. Which on one hand you might say, well, 36% sounds great, and that's pretty high, right? But 20-point margins are uncommon in American politics, and there are, I think, some voters who are on the fence who probably don't like this, right? Most Trump supporters do, but like, he didn't have a winning coalition anyway. You take a few more people away from that, and maybe it's not such a great strategy. I mean, I don't know, right? In Georgia, the Democrats have held up a little better in polls than I would have thought. They're a teeny tiny bit ahead when I would have probably guessed they'd be a teeny tiny bit behind. Whether those polls are accurate and what that means for election day is to be determined, obviously. It's also a little hard to know, like, to Perry's point, like, I don't know how much kind of the average voter thought, oh, democracy is on the ballot, right? What was the Biden campaign running on, right? I'd say, number one, the Biden campaign was running on COVID and Trump's handling of COVID. And then there's kind of like, number two might be this message of we have to unify the country, right? Decency, honor kind of stuff, right? But that can have like a lot of different meanings for a lot of different people, right? I don't think there was that much explicit vote for Biden or democracy messaging. Well, there was some of that. Obama in his convention speech kind of went there, right? At other points in time, the Biden-Harris campaign has kind of been like, yeah, this is all kind of silly, and we're going to win. So they've been pretty nonchalant about it at other points in time. So if you had Democrats explicitly running on like a don't vote for Republicans or democracies, I don't know how that would do. It might do okay, but how much that was present in the most recent election, 2020, I don't know either. We're saying I don't know a lot.
As you mentioned there, it's been an interesting decision from Democrats not to really kind of come out swinging against a lot of these attempts. I don't know if it sounds like it must be a tactical decision in order to amplify some of these accusations about rigged elections and voter fraud and things like that. I mean, is that what they've decided, that it would hurt them to amplify it further, or they want to redirect attention somewhere else? I mean, why haven't Democrats, even just since the election, been a lot more vocal about this?
Have they not been vocal? I don't know. Democrats or liberal leaning or even not so liberal leaning journalists on Twitter have been pretty vocal about it. It's probably not the world that normal people live in.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like, as far as Democratic leaders in Congress, Pelosi, Schumer, the